Thank you for your interest in Columbia Business School Executive Education. Unfortunately, due to an unforeseen problem with our audio equipment, the webinar you are about to hear is not up to our typical standards. We do believe that the insight offered by Frank Rose is worth sharing with our audience, so we have decided to provide the recording to you in this abbreviated format. Thank you for your understanding, and be sure to tune in for our next complimentary webinar.
Thanks, Matt. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Appreciate it. So I want to talk a little bit today about the power of story, about why narrative is such an effective way of communicating. And along the way, we'll dip into some of the research in neuroscience and cognitive psychology that has changed the way we think about stories, changed our understanding of how they work and why. So I want to start by telling you a story about a 7-year-old schoolboy named Raymond. Raymond lived in a small town in Kansas, which is the name of the town was Oskaloosa, and on a really good day it had a population of about 750. In 1949, Raymond was the subject of a study by Roger Barker, who was the chairman of the psychology department at the University of Kansas. Psychology at the time was dominated by people like B.F. Skinner, people who were all about conducting lab experiments. Barker thought that whole thing was nonsense. He wanted to do what Jane Goodall would later do with chimpanzees in Tanzania. He wanted to do this with his own species. He wanted to study Homo sapiens in its natural habitat. So he set up what he called the Midwest Psychological Field Station on the second floor of this bank building in the center of town. And he conducted a study which was really just a minute-by-minute account of Raymond's activities during a 14-hour day in 1949. And 2 years later, it was published as One Boy's Day, a specimen record of behavior. Now, 60 years went by, and then a group of psychologists at Washington University in St. Louis decided that they would make Barker's book the focus of an experiment, a neuroimaging experiment, actually, where one that was designed to understand how we handle stories, how we process them. And what they found when they gave people, small bits of Raymond's day to read, was that when Raymond picked up his workbook, say, readers experienced brain activity in regions that are associated with grasping motion. When he shook his head no, the part of the brain lit up that was believed to deal with goal-directed activity. And when he walked up to his teacher's desk, he had activity in areas that were thought to deal with location in space. The conclusion, according to these researchers, was that these results support the view that readers understand the story by simulating events in the real world. This is downtown Oskaloosa, Kansas. Today it hasn't really changed very much, except the windows in the field station are boarded up. But the study has really been a bit of a landmark, and it inspired people like the cognitive psychologist Raymond Marr and Keith Usley in Toronto, who wrote a paper several years ago called "The Function of Fiction is the Abstraction and Simulation of Social Experience." They argue that, like computer simulations, stories model and abstract the human social world. And far from just a simple retelling of events, stories are highly selective accounts. They communicate complex social information, and they offer personal enactments of experience. Because they're abstractions, they really demand that readers project themselves into the story. This makes sense. It sort of explains why we get scared in horror movies. It's really, what happens, I think, is that immersion is really just an extreme form of this projection. Now, why would we want to immerse ourselves in the first place? Brian Boyd, the leading biographer of Nabokov, tackles this issue in a book he wrote called On the Origin of Stories, which is quite fascinating. It's a literary Darwinist inquiry into the genesis and purpose of narrative. According to Boyd, fiction trains us to understand very quickly real-life social situations, to make inferences, to see situations from other people's points of view. And he also writes that fiction encourages us to do this not just once, but over and over. This point is really key. It entices us again and again to immerse ourselves in stories, he writes. It helps us over time to rehearse and refine our apprehension of events. So this explains, for example, why little kids maybe want to hear the same story over and over, or see the same movie over and over again. Because stories contain lessons, and by immersing ourselves in them, we learn those lessons more effectively, just as we might learn a foreign language more effectively by immersing ourselves in it. So the need for immersion is actually, I think, deeply rooted in the human psyche. It's a fundamentally adaptive response. Now, it turns out also that immersion has a side benefit. There's a researcher named Melanie Green, who's now at SUNY Buffalo. She was several years ago as a graduate student at Ohio State. She did some very, very interesting experiments. Focused on really how to determine how or even whether stories affect people's opinions and people's views of the world. She asked test subjects to read a vivid account of a little girl who was being randomly stabbed to death by a mental patient at a shopping center. Some participants were told the story was true. Some participants were told that it was fiction. But the questions that they were asked afterwards were, for example, whether psychiatric patients should be allowed in the community, how likely violence is to occur in public places, whether we live in a fundamentally just world. And what she wanted to know is, would people who are more deeply immersed in the story react differently from those who were not? First, of course, she had to figure out which readers were deeply immersed or transported in the language of psychology. It's sort of objectively apparent, obviously, if someone is immersed in water, but immersed in a story, not so much. So Green developed what she called a transportation scale. It consisted of 15 statements like, I wanted to learn how the narrative ended, or while reading the narrative, I had a vivid image of a particular scene or a particular character. And then people were asked to rank their responses on a 7-point scale from not at all to very much. So what she found was that emotional involvement is a really key factor in people's propensity to immerse themselves in the story. And also how readily people project themselves into the story. She found, too, that the more they were transported by the story, the more likely they were to express opinions that were consistent with it, such as mental patients should not be let out unsupervised. And the less likely they were to find fault with this point of view. It turns out that whether they were told the story was fact or fiction made no difference whatever. Subsequent research has come up with very similar results. In a much later experiment at Ohio State, people were asked to, also showed that people tend to spontaneously assume the identity of the main character in the story. And that the more thoroughly they do so, the more likely they are to change their attitudes and their behavior afterwards. People were less inclined, however, to merge identities with a character who was different in some way from them. For example, if the main character was black or if the main character was gay. But if they read a story about someone who was black or gay and they weren't told that until very late in the story, they tended to emerge with a significantly more favorable view, more favorable attitude towards that group. Excuse me. By then, it seemed it was too late for people to turn back. So what happens, I think, is that advocacy messages, whether they're for a cause or a brand, automatically invite scrutiny. They prompt us to put our guard up. Stories don't. Stories encourage us to identify with the characters they portray. And by inducing the willing suspension of disbelief, they leave us predisposed to accept their premises. Increasingly today, I think, people, it seems more and more, want to be immersed. They want immersive experiences. Last year, J. Walter Thompson, the ad agency, conducted a poll of people in the U.S. and the UK. And they found that 6 out of 10 crave experiences that stimulate the senses. And 7 out of 10 like marketing or entertainment that tries to engage the imagination. But what's really striking here, I think, is the age breakdown. Millennials turn out to be far more committed to the idea than boomers do, and Gen X tends to be somewhat in between. I think maybe you can chalk it up to video games and the internet. In 20th century mass media taught us to be passive consumers, consumers of entertainment, consumers of advertising. That era is ending. As I was saying, mass media taught us to be passive consumers, and I think digital media now are teaching us to be very different, to have a very different relationship with media, with stories, to be much more active. One person who's been responding to this is James Cameron. I interviewed him in, I think it was 2006 for Wired. At that point, he was developing Avatar. It had not yet been greenlit, and he was on this soundstage in Montreal for a movie that was being shot, actually the first feature film using the stereoscopic camera that he had invented with that case. So I actually got quite a bit of time with him, and because he didn't really have a lot to do on the soundstage. And we talked a bit about Avatar. He didn't want to go into details about the story then, but he did describe it as sort of a figure right action adventure story that happened to take place on another planet. And he said that for him, the best way to tell that kind of story was by creating a kind of actor-like complexity. He said the casual viewer can enjoy it without having to drill down to the secondary and tertiary levels of detail. You can simply enjoy the movie. But for the real fan, you go in an order of magnitude and boom, there's a whole set of new patterns. You can step in and polish a pen as many times as you want, and it still holds up. And to me, he said, that's the best science fiction. So what he was talking about here, fractals, of course, a fractal is sort of a never-ending pattern. You can go infinitely deep, and the pattern keeps repeating itself. Nature is full of fractals. For instance, trees, rivers, coastlines, mountains, seashells, hurricanes. Abstract fractals, such as this one, can be generated by a computer, calculating a simple equation over and over. But what Cameron was talking about was the kind of storytelling that goes